Hello, it's John Heaton and welcome to the final instalment of my Imaginary Beatles album series. So this is the final one, and after that I'll go back to doing the more normal stuff, or back to what I do best, as some of you have said. Anyway, so I had to finish this one, as Magnus Magnusson once said, once I've started, now I'll finish. So I've taken a break, as I mentioned earlier, for the second half of the 70s when John wasn't active. And then he made a comeback in 1980, and then of course we lost him. So this is a bittersweet one to do. In many ways it's maybe the most interesting because it's the last period where all four Beatles were alive. After that the solo careers continued, but there was obviously something missing with John gone, and then later with George gone. But at this time, 79-80, all fit and healthy and recording. Not regularly recording, but sporadically recording in the case of Ringo, and then John making a comeback. Paul had kept active all the time since Venus and Mars, putting out several albums, and I haven't drawn from those albums, although there's some great material on Speed of Sound, London Town, and a couple of singles. I've restricted this particular Beatles Imaginary album to this final album from John and Yoko, the subsequent posthumous Milk and Honey, this superb one from George, 79, this great Wings album from 79, Back to the Egg, and this McCartney album, McCartney 2 from 1980. So those are what I've drawn, and it's quite a rich amount of material to draw from, and so I've made it a double album. I'm going to go through the tracks. I've started off with I'm Losing You, which I think is, as Carr and Tyler said in their book, may have made a better starter or a better taster single for the Double Fantasy project. Starting Over is a great track, but if a little sentimental and not quite with it, not quite au courant in terms of what the rest of the charts were doing. So maybe I'm Losing You might have been a more interesting and more contemporary single, and it's a better song, I think. And there's a great version of this by Cheap Trick in the studio with Lennon, which was ultimately discarded, which is very interesting, a bit rough around the edges. One of the criticisms of I'm Losing You of Double Fantasy is a little bit too slick, but I think that's splitting hairs. I think it's a wonderful production. I think Earl Slick and Hugh McCracken are on great form, and it's one of John's very best solo songs, and I think would have made a good opener for this particular album. Some of you have asked me to come up with titles for these albums, and I haven't got round to doing that, but I'm sure we could pick one of the tracks as a suitable title. Then I've got Nobody Told Me, which was released in 1984 as a Lennon single, but Lennon intended this for Ringo, so I've got Ringo singing it on this particular hypothetical album. I think he could have done it well. Followed that with Old Siam Sir, the great rocker from Back to the Egg. I think it's a tremendous song. Didn't get very high in the charts, I think about number 23 in the UK, and wasn't released as a single in the US. But I think it's Wings rocking away quite effectively, and one of the best tracks on Back to the Egg. Then I followed it up with, and the beauty of this compilation is you've got such a, I mean, to be able to draw on this wonderful album from George, where all 10 tracks are worthy of an inclusion on a Beatles album, in my opinion. So I've been a bit spoilt, and I've included Love Comes to Everyone, which is the opener from that album. As the next track from George. Eric plays the guitar intro at the beginning. I followed that with I Don't Want to Face It from Milk and Honey, which is not a finished version on Milk and Honey, but you could see the potential of the song. Great guitar again from Earl Slick and co, and great drumming from Andy Newmark. People have read something into the lyrics, whether it meant something. Look at myself in the mirror, I don't see anybody there, and stuff like that. But I think, you know, that's with hindsight, it's easy to read meanings into the lyrics. I think it's just a fun rocker. And John sometimes didn't want to face it in the last few years of his life, didn't want to face the press, didn't want to face the public, and didn't want the pressure of having to record. So quite an honest lyric, I think. And then I followed that with Arrow Through Me, which was the single from Back to the Egg in the US and got to number 20, I believe. A very atmospheric song from Paul, very melodic. Lovely tune, nice use of synthesizers. They're all playing synthesizers in the video, all the members of Wings, very effective. And then close side one, We Blow Away from George, which should have been a massive hit single. Apparently it was in the US quite a successful single. I think it hit the top 20. But for some reason in the UK, it only reached number 51, which I found heartbreaking at the time, because I thought one of George's best ever tracks. And I think Bob Woofenden in his book said if it had arrived, if this album, George Harrison, had arrived at the beginning of the decade as opposed to at the end, it would have been a huge seller, and I think it's probably right, because the material is just second to none, or second to All Things Must Pass, possibly. So that closes side one very strongly, and then side two we've got John's Watching the Wheels, his whimsical look back on his sabbatical from the rock business and how he was just happy to sit there and watch people go by, and very, very moving song, one of the very best on Double Fantasy, if not the best. Great use of piano, which is John and George Small both playing, I think. And just a great track all round. And Dark Sweet Lady next from George, beautiful ballad for Olivia, his new wife, who he'd been with for about 4 or 5 years by the time the George Harrison album came out. But this was the first album. Well, he'd also sung love songs to her on 33 and a Third, and then even more so on this one. There's like 4 or 5 beautiful love songs to Olivia on here. And that's one of them. Dear Yoko from John is next, a fun, happy-go-lucky rocker from Double Fantasy. Nothing earth-shattering, but great fun. I'm sure the Beatles could have made a good version of this. Followed that with Winter Rose, Love Awake, the medley from Paul from Back to the Egg. Very melodic, very beautiful tune, particularly on Love Awake. Nice harmonies. I thought of including the rocker To You on this, but couldn't quite manage to fit it in. But I think I've got it as a bonus track, but that's another good one. But I went with the slower material because I think this one was hard to leave out. And then I've gone with another soft. Maybe this side two is the softer one of the two, like the White Album is maybe for the Beatles. Got Soft Touch, which is maybe an homage to his newly born son. Beautiful lyrics, beautiful tune, written in Hawaii apparently, and it's just got love and warmth all over it, and a melody to die for, to use my favourite expression. George on top form. Beautiful Boy, again, nicely sequenced in my opinion. After Soft Touch, we got John's homage to his son, Sean, and Out on the Ocean, Sailing Away. I Can Hardly Wait to See You Come of Age. But I guess we'll just have to be patient. And of course, tragically, he wasn't able to see him come of age, and we all see what a talented musician Sean became, but John was not to see that, unfortunately. Then we've got Coming Up, the single, and I was going to show you my single copy of that, but I can't find it. But nice cover on that, and nice hit, and by all accounts, this was the song when John heard on the radio, which prompted him to come out of hibernation and go into the recording studio. So we have that to thank Paul for, if nothing else. And in my opinion, it's a great song. And the A-side is far superior to the Wings live version. And John agreed in an interview in 1980, I like the one he did in his barn, he said. And the record company have got a nerve for promoting the other side, which they did in the US. They literally promoted the live version as the A-side. But I think this is the one, the studio version is the one which would go on this Imaginary Beatles album. Closes side two. Side three opens with Faster, and I do have the single of that. This rather unimaginative front cover, but then the bonuses are inside. We have the lyrics of the song on the back with the picture of him and Jackie Stewart, and then we have a picture disc. So this is quite rare. It didn't do much in the charts, unfortunately. I think it's a great song, one of George's very best. Someone complaining, oh, he ruined the mood by writing a song about motor racing. But if you listen to the lyrics, they're not just about speedy cars. They're quite philosophical. About some had come to see him fail and stuff. I love the lyrics to this track. I think it's a great track, and it will make a great opener to side three of this double album. Then we got the B-side of Good Night Tonight, Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, which came out on this 12-inch, on this, well, also released on 7-inch. Daytime, Nighttime Suffering. Quite how this track was left off, Back to the Egg, I'll never know. They could have put a lesser track on the B-side of Goodnight Tonight and included Daytime, Nighttime on the album, but they didn't. But that strengthened that single. It's one of Paul's very best singles of the 70s, in my opinion, and one of Paul and Linda's favourite tracks of the entire 70s, I think, and rightly so. I think it's great. Then I've got Clean Up Time from John, from Double Fantasy. Again, nice lyrics summing up his cleaning up from drugs and drink and just being healthy again and being into the family and not too much extracurricular activity, recreation-wise anyway. He did make the return to the recording studio, but he managed to be a little bit more responsible and not subject himself to the temptations, you know, with the other musicians and drinking and drugs and all that. So, nice song from John. Then Getting Closer, the underrated rocker from Back to the Egg, which I think was a minor hit in the US as a single. In fact, I think it might have been a double A-side with Arrow Through Me, from if memory serves me right, in which case it got to number 20. It didn't do very well in the UK for some reason. But I think it's underrated, and at the time I remember friends at school saying this is not much, but I think hindsight's been quite kind to Back to the Egg, and it's an album which, if you go back to now, it has stood the test of time well, and followed that with another top-notch ballad from here, Your Love Is Forever, with a superb slide guitar solo. Again, this is another one of the songs for Olivia, and just, you know, this album's full of ballads, but there are so many of them and really hard to leave off, and Waterfalls is another one, another ballad from McCartney too. Just beautiful, very sparse, you know. Whether it would have been a full Beatles performance, probably not. Probably would have just been Paul doing a virtually solo performance, maybe a bit of percussion from Ringo, I'm not sure, but I had to put it on there because it is an achingly beautiful tune. And then I have finished side 3 with Woman, the timeless classic song to Yoko from John, and to all women, not just Yoko. The other half of the sky, to quote famous Chairman Mao's famous statement. And John was very clear in his interviews around this time that how much Yoko and how much women represented to him, having taken advantage of them for most of his adult life. Now he was firmly in his feminist period and recognizing the value and the role that women play in society, and actually living up to his image as a feminist by living it, not just talking about it as he had done 8 years ago, for example, on Women as the Nigger. So that very strong closer to side 3, and we opened side 4 with the A-side of this single, Goodnight Tonight. It's a great foray into disco, in my opinion. Okay, everyone was doing disco at the time, but I think Paul has a decent stab at it, and his bass playing just lifts the song all the way through, and very imaginative production and backing vocals. I love it. And then we've got George's second to last track on the album, If You Believe, the song he wrote with Gary Wright, with great lyrics reminiscent of Ringo's song What Goes Around, in terms of, you know, everything you do comes back to you if you believe, everything you thought was possible. If You Believe, very philosophical lyric and great tune, and quite an upbeat song for that album. What was a lot of laid back stuff on there, but it was good to close with that track. And then I've opened it with I'm Stepping Out from John, which on the Milk and Honey album is a little unfinished, and I was a little bit wary of including this because as it stands on Milk and Honey it's not a great track, but I think John would have fleshed it out and done something more imaginative with the production and made it more polished and more sound like a finished song. It's obviously work in progress as we hear it, but you know, that's all we have because we lost John, and so I've included it because I think the potential was there to make it into something decent. Then I've got Ringo's final track, second track and final track, Sure to Fall in Love with You, which is a cover track of the Carl Perkins number, which he did on Stop and Smell the Roses. And the reason I've included it is because Paul McCartney is on very distinctive bass duties on here, and they recorded this song in France around about October 1980, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney spoke on the phone when Paul was in that studio in France. So, and I think in that phone call they agreed that John agreed that he also spoke to Ringo, and he agreed he would also contribute to that album, which later became Stop and Smell the Roses. So I think, if nothing else, that Ringo would have got the four Beatles to contribute to his following album, because George and Paul are on it and John would have been. So that's why I've included this one. Slightly sorry that it didn't happen with John joining Ringo in the studio, but there you go. Here's Paul and Ringo together doing a nice version of the Carl Perkins number. And George's final track on the album is Soft-Hearted Hannah, the humorous track from George Harrison, with the conversation in the pub at the beginning from his local in Henley, very amusing, and the warped sound of the timing at the end, thinking you're something wrong with your turntable, but it's not, it was done deliberately. And then I finished off with John's, a bit interesting or weird, I suppose, to finish off with starting over from John to close the album, or almost close the album. But you know, maybe that sums up the whole of this double album. The Beatles were starting a new decade, and you know, there was more stuff, more great stuff to come had they all lived, had John lived, but he didn't, as we know. So I think the perfect and slightly sad end to the album, maybe appropriately, is One of These Days from Paul. It's a superb closer to McCartney too, and I think, you know, just for that reason alone, not just because it's on McCartney 2 as a closer, just because the words are just so beautiful. One of these days when my feet are on the ground, I'm going to look around and see what's right and see what's there, and breathe fresh air ever after. Ever after, breathe fresh air ever after. Achingly sung by Paul, not always the happy-go-lucky thumbs-up Beatle that his image indicates. He's capable of pretty sorrowful, mournful tracks such as this, and all the better for it. So great closer to the album, in my opinion. Then the bonus tracks, I've got another track from McCartney 2, Nobody Knows, which I think is a fun track. I think John would have enjoyed playing along with that. Here Comes the Moon from George. Real Love from John, which obviously was done as the anthology comeback single, or one of them, and that was demoed by John in 1980. And then To You, the track from Back to the Egg, which didn't quite make the cut. So this is the album. We've got 9 Paul, 9 John, 8 George, and 2 Ringo, if you can read that. So that's the final instalment of this series. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.